Welcome to Painfully Fast Gadgets. Gadgets so fast, it hurts. I'm your host, Mark, sometimes known as the MWE. Wait. Sorry, wrong video. Welcome back, Gadgeteers. No, but seriously, I just wanted to pay an homage to one of my favorite YouTubers out there, Painfully Honest Tech. Watch you all the time. Anyway, let's get right into it. Have you ever wondered how much those phones you're buying really cost you? Well, you've probably heard some facts and possibly some fiction and maybe some figures on how much it actually costs to make one of those fancy cell phones you're using, like the iPhone, but you weren't really sure. Even worse, you read an article about some of those figures and you've been spouting the numbers like it's true. But is it? Well, we're going to find out today. We're going to give you a little bit more knowledge on the price of a smartphone. In particular, we'll have a look at the iPhones. And you'll be able to talk in a conversation and sound like you know what you're talking about. Let's have a look at an article, first of all, from techwalls.com called The Real Production Cost of Smartphone. First off, I wanted to point out that what they're listing here is the production cost of smartphones. I actually disagree with that. Now, TechWalls calls it the real production cost of smartphones, but personally, I consider this not even just the production cost, and you'll see why in a minute. I consider this just a bill of goods. Let's talk about what we mean by a bill of goods. Basically, if you ever built a computer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you order a series of parts off of Newegg or Amazon and they show up at your house, that is not the cost of production. That is cost of goods only. So you haven't done anything with them yet. You haven't put it together. You haven't tested the system, possibly selling it to another person. There's a whole bunch of other costs in there that haven't been factored in yet. So it is not the production costs. So consider it a bill of goods. We'll talk about the actual production costs. So let's look down at this list here. And again, we were talking about this not really being a production cost, but a bill of goods. And here we have profit margin again. I don't think that's correct. Let's call it gross income. Now, most of you who are out there working know what gross income is. It's basically the money you make before all expenses are taken out. Once you take the expenses out, you have, of course, net income, okay? But this is not profit margin, so this would really be gross income. In other words, we haven't taken the expenses associated with making the phone out, except for the bill of goods, which is only one expense. All right, so we haven't really gotten all of them yet. But purely looking at the production cost, in other words, the bill of goods and the retail price that Apple is selling their phones for, you get a profit margin, which is the difference between the bill of goods cost and the final sale price of the phone. Now check out the XS Max 256 gigabyte. It's coming in at 64.53%, which is a good difference. And then it gets a little lower on the 10, which is 61%. Now, if we were to go down through this whole list, which actually does have some other phones in it as well, we find that in actuality, the highest percentage difference between the bill of goods and the retail price was here with the Apple iPhone 5S. 64 gigabyte, which came in at 74%. So the difference between bill of goods and that final retail price, a whopping 74%. That's quite a chunk of change. So some people may say, yeah, the difference between the bill of goods and the final retail price is actually higher today. That's not true. It's lower. So it's about 10% lower than it has been in the past. So the cost to buy the goods has went up. So has the retail price. But what are some of the other costs that a company deals with when they're producing a piece of technology? Well, there's quite a few out there. First of all, we have to pay for research and development. Now, again, I use that analogy of building a computer. Today's computers are remarkably complicated compared to computers of even 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So when you think of building, say, a gaming PC, the knowledge that you have after doing all that research of building previous computers, possibly you gathered an education by going to school, allows you to understand, for example, a specific power supply, whether it's modular or not, how many rails it has, the longevity of the power supply based on your experience, and so on and so forth. And that's just one part. So research and development does play a role in the cost factor that we're not seeing here in this list. Another one, marketing. That's pretty obvious. How do you find out that these iPhones are for sale? Well, you hear about it through marketing. Assembly. Now, this is a concept in accounting, which I know is dry and boring, called property, plant, and equipment. And basically what we're looking at is the overall cost factor for getting the property. Plant would be like the ability to have power for the plant, the equipment that constructs and assembles the phones, and so on and so forth. And of course, equipment, which is an addition to plant. So then we have staff. You've got to pay staff to do this. Now, when we're talking about property, think of it this way. We've got factories that we use to build the phones. We have warehouses that we use to store the phones. We've got Apple stores where we give support for the phones. From plant, we've got assembly machines, power, heating, cooling, all these different factors that come into play. When we talk about assembly, we've got shippers that have to do the work. Excuse me, not assembly, I mean staff. Assemblers, geniuses, if you want to call them that are at the Apple stores to give you support and help you out and also sell technology to you. We've got management and upper management, which isn't cheap. We want to get, given the company that's publicly traded here, we're talking about Apple, the best CEO. Well, that doesn't come cheap. The best CEO is going to bring in the most money for the investor, and that is the bottom line for a company, to increase shareholder wealth. Now, technically speaking, sometimes CEOs go off the rails and they are corrupt or whatever, and they mismanage a company and the shareholders don't get their money and they get angry, and eventually what happens? We see a new CEO, or worst case scenario, the company goes bupkis. And we've got research and development teams, so we've got to pay all these people. These are all part of our expenses. We talked about distribution and shipping. There's some hideous expenses that we have to pay. One is income taxes. Nobody wants to pay income taxes, but let me tell you, we're going to have a look in just a second at how much Apple pays in income taxes annually, and I think you're going to find it quite staggering. The other thing that we all pay, no matter what, is inflation, which is the value of a dollar over time. So the average increase in inflation is about 3%. So basically every dollar that you have, the next year or the year after that, you're going to end up paying about 3 pennies more on the dollar for whatever it is you happen to be buying. Now, you should see this and know that it's there, but the fact is most people don't even think about that as an expense, but it really is. So how do we offset inflation? We increase the retail price of the product. That's the only way that you can combat inflation. So looking at that PC analogy isn't really good this time, because the cost of PCs was very expensive in the past, even compared to today's dollars. But homes, on the other hand, or cars, you could use as an analogy. 50, 60 years ago, people were paying $500 for a car, which was a lot of money back then. But if you adjust it for inflation, it's more or equal to what we pay today for a car. A car is a significant investment for any family. So that's what inflation does for us. Now, here's the problem. We can't take all these expenses and break them down and look at them individually for each segment of Apple, because they don't provide you that information. That's inside information. But because they are a publicly traded company, they do have to provide some information to the government, specifically a report called the 10K report to the Security and Exchange Commission annually. And we can go over there and look at that. And it does actually tell us some very interesting information. First thing I'm going to look at is the business and the products that Apple is into. Now, we all know most of these, but when you think of the income that Apple is making, they list first, of course, the iPhone, which is a huge segment of their income. Then they have iPads, Macs, operating systems, application software services, iCloud services, Apple Care, Apple Pay, other products like accessories and Apple TV. They've got Apple Watch and iPod Touch. So there is other factors that make money for Apple besides just the iPhone. But like I said, in the 10K at the very least, they don't really give us specific information. But what we can find out if we go down to the financial statements and supplementary data is how much money is Apple making. So after all expenses are taken out, is Apple making more money? Now remember that margin is 64% on the price of the iPhone and the actual bill of goods. So that sounds really good, and you think to yourself, boy, Apple must be making money hand over fist. I heard they're a $1 trillion company. Well, that's a whole nother number. $1 trillion company just means its total value in all its assets and everything it has, including intellectual property. It's another thing that people don't think about very much. Intellectual property, meaning they are the only ones who know how to make that iOS or macOS work with the hardware in that sweet fashion that they do. Nobody else knows how to do that. Only Apple. So let's take a look at the consolidated statement of operations. This is an interesting report here that gives us some information about Apple's income. If you look up here, now I want you to keep in mind that this is in millions, so I'm going to convert it to billions every time I give you a number just to make it easier. We've got net sales here of 229,234 million, or $229 billion. Now that sounds like a whole heck of a lot of money, and they're just pulling it in, raking it in hand over fist, but they're not. They actually have to deal with cost of sales at about $141 billion. Ow, man, can you imagine paying that? So their gross margin before the cost of sales is $88 billion, but we're not done. They have research and development that they have to pay for, which is $11.5 billion. They have selling, general and administrative costs, which come in at $15.2 billion. So their total operating expenses is $26.2. So it gets kind of depressing here, because if we continue on, we see that their total net income after all their expenses, including, and we were talking about this, income tax is $15.7 billion with a B dollars. Their net income for 2017, which is the newest 10K report we have on Apple because 2018 isn't over yet, $48.3 billion. Now here, if we look back, is what's interesting. Year before, 2016, they made $45.6 billion. And the year before that, in 2015, they actually brought in $53.39 billion. So even though the cost of the phones continues to increase, remember in 2017, they had the first iPhone 10, or the first $1,000 cell phone. And quite frankly, what it meant for them is a slight increase from the previous year, but the fact is, it's not just the iPhone, it's everything else too. So we can take, for example, the iPod Touch. Let's just say, for sake of argument, they decide to discontinue that because it's actually been costing them money to produce the iPod and it's not selling enough. Now, here's one thing that really stinks about sales. If you're selling a product and the total cost to produce it is not being paid down because it's not selling, so you decide to offer it at a discount and discontinue the product, you're going to take a loss on that particular product. And what that means is your other segments of your business need to do good in order to make money. And that's essentially what's going on with Apple. So I'm using the iPod Touch as an example. I can't tell you if it is losing money or not. I believe it's discontinued anyway. But the fact is, some segments of Apple aren't going to do all that well, and it'll be a cost factor, and they unfortunately will have to pay. Now, one of the things that I know has come up this year is that they've been in disagreement with Ireland on whether or not they have to pay income taxes. Well, Apple has finally capitulated and agreed to pay those income taxes instead of a lengthy court battle, only to probably lose and still have to pay the income taxes in the long run. That is an unforeseen cost for Apple. I shouldn't say unforeseen. I think they knew somehow they were going to pay something, but they weren't sure what. But they ended up paying, I believe, 100%, which, if I'm not mistaken, was something like $15 or $20 billion. So that's a cost here that hurts the bottom line. So we may see a bottom line next year that's lower than $48 billion. So the bottom line is, just because the cost of the iPhone goes up doesn't mean Apple's making more money hand over fist. As a matter of fact, it is a calculated maneuver, and they know they had to increase the cost because they weren't going to make enough money. They've got to stay in the positive here to being a going concern, which is basically a company that's doing a fantastic job and making a lot of money. So when you buy that iPhone next time and somebody says, yeah, I heard the profit margin is 64% and it only really cost $450 for that iPhone, say that is not accurate even a little bit. And when they say, what's the actual number, say, well, we can't tell you the actual number because there are many factors involved. What we can tell you is the net income for Apple is actually dropped since 2015 by about, looks like, $5 billion. So even though the cost of the iPhone goes up, Apple actually is making less money because the cost of doing business has gone up. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. If you didn't, drop me a line and tell me how dumb I am and how I don't know anything, because I get a big kick out of it. As always, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. Painfully Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets.